creator of Resident Evil. Dino Crisis.
Dino Crisis. Ring a bell? A lot of people may not be familiar with the franchise, however, it no doubt has a loyal fanbase that are longing for a new installment. After Resident Evil 2 received its glorious remake, and Resident Evil 3 also getting the same treatment, despite not being nearly as good, fans such as myself are hoping that Dino Crisis also gets a remake. So, in today's video, I thought I would take a look back at the series and its strange evolution in an effort to understand why we haven't had a new Dino Crisis for nearly 2 decades. Also, why I think now is the perfect time for a new installment in the same vein as the RE remakes. Now, without further ado, let's go back to where it all started. July 1st, 1999. Dino Crisis is released on the PlayStation and Dreamcast. For those who are unfamiliar with the game, it was heavily described as Resident Evil with dinosaurs. Shinji Mikami, who played a pivotal role in the development of the first 2 Resident Evil games, produced and directed the first Dino Crisis hot off the heels of Resident Evil 2. He wanted to create a game that delivered a different kind of horror. Horror he coined panic horror. For those that did play Dino Crisis, I think we can all agree that that game did indeed induce a significant amount of panic. You play as Regina, a special operations agent sent with a team to investigate a secluded island facility after learning that world-renowned scientist Dr. Edward Kirk has been leading a secret weapons project on the island. Shortly after your time on the island, it soon becomes apparent that the facility is overrun with, you guessed it, dinosaurs. Now the plot is a lot of nonsensical sci-fi silliness with time travel being a focal point, however, it never detracts from the overall enjoyment or the survival horror aspect. On the surface, it is easy to call Dino Crisis a Resident Evil clone, with vicious dinosaurs replacing the walking corpses instead. However, there is much more than meets the eye here. Yeah, it retains similar gameplay elements such as puzzles and fixed camera angles, but Dino Crisis really was its own unique experience, taking a lot of steps to differentiate from its zombie counterpart. One of the biggest differences was that the environments were rendered in real time, opposed to pre-rendered ones. This greatly enhanced the immersion at the time, as characters looked as if they were actually a part of the environments. As well as this, it introduced the ability to walk and shoot at the same time, which meant combat was a lot less stiff compared to the Resident Evil games. The game also featured choices that impacted gameplay and the narrative. It had multiple endings which, whilst not significantly different, was still a nice touch, especially for its time. Dino Crisis was pure survival horror in every sense, and the dinosaurs made for an extremely terrifying threat. The game was developed to have more consistent visceral terror, and thanks to the dinosaurs, it definitely did. They were quick, intelligent, and relentless, which made for a far more intense experience than any other survival horror game at the time. This also meant that combat was a lot more challenging, despite being able to walk and shoot. The scarcity of ammo meant that your encounters with these prehistoric carnivores was even more frightening. Even if you did store up quite a bit of ammo, you'd still find yourself firing way more bullets into a group of raptors to bring them down than you ever would with a group of zombies. Another aspect I really want to touch on quickly is the music. The game nails music. In fact, this is noticeable throughout every entry. It was a main contributor to the atmosphere and made encounters with dinosaurs even more frantic. Composers Makoto Tomozawa and Akari Kaida, I hope I pronounced those right, were also the composers for Resident Evil. They nailed the score. It makes creeping around corridors and offices so much more unsettling. All of these elements came together to make for a genuinely terrifying game that induced the panic Mikami was going for. It had a fantastic atmosphere and was all in all a very good game. It moved the survival horror genre forward despite not sharing the popularity of its zombie cousin. The game was a critical and commercial success, with the PlayStation version selling over 2.4 million copies and reviewers praising the game for its intensity, graphics and gameplay.
You're extinct!
Now when a game does that well, it's almost guaranteed that it's getting a sequel. Just 14 months after the release of the first game, Dino Crisis 2 released on the 13th of September 2000, exclusively on the PlayStation. Now, whilst most survival horror sequels tend to stick to what works and make certain improvements here and there, Dino Crisis 2 completely reinvented the franchise. For the second installment, Capcom essentially abandoned the survival horror route and opted to create a more action-orientated experience. I always compare this change to the first two Alien films. The first film was very focused on delivering a claustrophobic horror, whereas the sequel went for a more action-packed approach. Both were amazing in their own way, and the same goes for the Dino Crisis games. Dino Crisis 2 featured more open areas and a greater variety of weapons and enemies. It provided a more arcade-style experience in that players would rack up combos and earn points as they killed dinosaurs. The player could then spend those points at computer stations where they could purchase new weapons and upgrades. With Capcom focusing on delivering an action-adventure game opposed to a survival horror, the elements that made the first game challenging were seemingly absent. In the first game, most players would want to avoid combat, however, the sequel has you constantly engaging in it. Since ammo is much more accessible than the first game, there's no need to conserve it, which means you can blast through enemies without any worries. As for the plot, Dino Crisis 2 delves further into the time-travelling aspect and embraces its sci-fi characteristics. After the events of the first game, Regina is sent through time on yet another rescue mission after an accident causes a research base, military institution, and a small town to be transported to another time. It was the 90s, what do you expect?
Sunfish, that's our favorite!
That's because there's a delicious ray of sunshine in every drop!
I've got to say that the mystery surrounding the narrative was actually quite interesting, and there's a bit more to the story than the first game. As well as Regina, you also control a secondary character, Dylan Morton, the rescue team leader. Each character has a different arsenal, which does keep the gameplay fresh when switching between characters. In terms of structure, the game was much more linear and didn't really encourage exploration. There's typically only one route available at a time, indicating that's where you need to go. There's also a lot of pointless back and forth, which gets very annoying, as well as a lack of engaging puzzles. However, for the most part, Dino Crisis 2 was a great game that established a new direction for the series that favoured action and style over spooks and scares. Despite being very different to its predecessor, it was met with mostly positive reviews which praised its originality and gameplay. And now, this brings us on to the third game. Okay. The third game released on the 26th of June 2003, exclusively on the Xbox. This in itself was very unusual, considering that the main player base would have been on the PlayStation and Dreamcast. However, this wasn't even the biggest problem. The game took place in space, set in the year 2548, and revolves around mutated space dinosaurs. It was absolutely crazy. Immediately, the premise caused some eyes to roll, but honestly, it still could have been a fun game. It wasn't, and this came down to the technical side of things, as well as very tedious gameplay. The controls were clunky and the camera was horrendous. Combine that with the terrible platforming segments and extremely repetitive combat, and you have yourself one dreadful game. The style and tone was completely different to the previous entries and essentially ignored them. Like Dino Crisis 2, you control two characters. However, the protagonists of this game were extremely bland and generic. After having two games playing as Regina and forming some form of a connection with her, it seemed like a slap in the face to disregard her and instead feature two characters that could be mistaken for cardboard. Despite the very silly plot, the game could have at least been somewhat fun if it wasn't for the frustrating controls and the camera. The actual designs of the alien dinosaurs were actually quite creative, but they weren't enough to save the game. Dino Crisis 3 was a huge disappointment to say the least, and was a missed opportunity to truly drive the series forward. Believe it or not, this wasn't always the plan for the third installment. The original premise of the game was meant to be a direct sequel to the second game, featuring Regina once again. The game had been conceptualized as a human drama, set in a city under siege from rampaging dinosaurs. The player, along with AI partners, would team up to fight them in ways that could impact the outcome of the plot. This sounds so much better. This sounds amazing. That is a game I want to play. Sadly, the reason this game was never made was due to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Capcom worried that the destroyed city environment and very nature of the game would be sensitive and upsetting to players. It would be really easy to pin the disappearance of the series on the disappointing Dino Crisis 3, yet there's definitely more factors that come into play. At a glance, the negative reception to the third game would seemingly be the reason for the series vanishing. However, one bad game is surely not enough to ruin a franchise, especially one with such a loyal following. The Resident Evil series had some very mediocre and negatively received games, yet Capcom has continued to release new games, and now the series is more popular than ever. What I propose is that the absence of Dino Crisis can be directed to the franchise itself. I mean, the third game cements exactly what the series had a problem with throughout: consistency. Now, what I mean by that is that Dino Crisis failed to establish exactly what Dino Crisis was. Each game tackled a different genre with different themes and atmospheres. This created a sense of uncertainty and, as a result, failed to establish exactly what the franchise was. From a publisher's perspective, it made no sense to allocate resources to a franchise that had no clear direction when there were other games that had a distinct identity and a comprehensible path to success. In addition to this, the interest in dinosaurs had already started to decline. Jurassic Park 3 released in 2001 and was met with average reviews from critics and audiences alike.
Alan!
People just stopped caring about these prehistoric beasts, and that was evident across all media formats. It's clear that audiences and developers still care about the franchise though. A group of fans are in the midst of developing a remake of the first game, and it looks fantastic. The demand for a new Dino Crisis game has only increased since Capcom started remaking the Resident Evil games, and it seems they're aware of the interest. There has been bursts of talk surrounding Dino Crisis throughout the past few years, and it's enough to get fans of the series a little excited. In March of 2017, Masachika Kawata, the producer of Resident Evil 7, stated in an interview, "If you were to create Dino Crisis with modern gaming technology, it would be a really exciting prospect." In December of the same year, a tweet from Capcom Studio 1 replied to a fan's request to remake the original game, simply saying, "If a lot of people wish." Finally, following the reveal of the Resident Evil 2 remake, an interview approached the subject of remakes with the company rep stating, "Regarding remakes and re-releases of titles in our back catalogue, we expect to explore these further with a variety of properties as part of our strategy to utilise our library of IP." Of course, none of this proves Capcom is working on a new game, but it does indicate that they are quite interested in developing remakes beyond Resident Evil, and is maybe discussing the possibility of a new Dino Crisis game. So apparently Capcom was doing more than just discussing it. Whilst I was making this video, I totally forgot that we did get some Dino Crisis news back in March of 2020, and I'm sad to say it's not great news. So it turns out that apparently there was a new Dino Crisis game in the works. According to Aesthetic Gamer, an insider who's known for his scoops on Capcom games, a Dino Crisis game was started a few years ago but then scrapped and buried for some unknown reason. Now, whilst the very idea of this franchise being put on ice breaks my heart, I'm a very optimistic person, and I like to think that at some point, us Dino Crisis fans will get what we deserve. Horror games have become increasingly popular over the years. It makes sense then for Capcom to reignite the flame and bring back the series, not only appeasing fans, but to bring in new ones too. In regards to the popularity of dinosaurs, both Jurassic World and Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom grossed over $1 billion each, and a third film is set to release in 2022. Numbers don't lie, and clearly people still have an interest in these wonderful, sometimes terrifying creatures. I truly believe at some point in the future we will get a new Dino Crisis game, be it a sequel, remake, or reboot. I mean, why would they start working on one if they didn't think people were interested? Can you imagine a Dino Crisis game made in the RE engine? It would be astonishing. I for one refuse to believe that this franchise is extinct.
Dino Crisis.
Anyways, that is it from me. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I do want to apologise for being gone for the past couple months. I've just been going through some shit and wanted to take a break from, the YouTube stuff. But I am back, and hopefully I'll be putting out content more regularly, be it the video essays or, just gaming videos. I hope to do it a lot more often. But yeah, that is it from me. If you guys enjoyed the video, maybe leave a like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you've played the Dino Crisis games. Let me know what you think, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.